I see some familiar faces and some familiar names. So it's just wonderful to see all of you. Let me just start my timer so that I don't go over time and we all have sufficient time to share our research and also for questions and answers. So let me just share with you that this is a new project for us because all these empirical studies, research studies were done separately and individually by us. And now we have developed this collaborative project in which we are looking at the issues of vulnerability as empowerment in these different contexts. So moving on, maybe we can go to the next slide. So what is it that we're trying to talk about? So what we are arguing is that that for the women that we focused on in these different contexts, in many cases, vulnerability emerged as strength or as empowerment, in other words. And this is a very interesting and yet a very complex finding. Because if we think about gender empowerment, it is defined as the ability of actors to be able to exert choice and control over social and economic outcomes that shape their lives. So gender empowerment is defined as the ability of people to be able to control their circumstances, to be able to control the factors that shape their present and future. Whereas vulnerability is seen as being synonymous to weakness, as something that makes individuals susceptible to harm and victimhood. So actually, gender empowerment, in other words, is defined as the ability to eliminate vulnerability, to eradicate vulnerability by being able to control our conditions and circumstances. So in other words, they're positioned as being oppositional to each other. And embedded in these ideas of gender empowerment and vulnerability is this notion that individual actors were able to control processes and outcomes and are able to transform uncertainty to certainty, are empowered, and they stand apart from populations that are vulnerable. And in this framework, access to education, access to economic markets are seen as tools that can transform the vulnerability of individuals and of groups into their empowerment. So when we are talking about historically marginalized groups or disadvantaged individuals and groups, we often call them vulnerable populations. And again, education or access to other resources and institutions are seen as processes and tools that can eliminate that uncertainty and that vulnerability from their lives. But as I shared earlier, that from our work in these different contexts, in different national and cultural contexts, actually highlighted this another process, this another lived experience where the ability of our participants to live with that uncertainty, to be able to surrender to some of these processes that were out of their control, actually was a source of strength and empowerment for them. So, of course, we'll go to each case study and we will talk about them in detail. But as we started looking at scholarship, we actually found a lot of support for this argument where they position vulnerability as something that actually can empower people. And some of those perspectives come from critical feminist background, and especially feminists who take spiritual perspective. And these are indigenous feminists, feminists of color, Black feminists like bell hooks, or Latinx feminists like Gloria Anzaldúa, or Muslim feminists like Sabah Mahmood. And in this, they spoke about how people feel very empowered when they feel that they're able to surrender to quote unquote a higher power, something that is outside of them, that is bigger than them, and that connects them to other people and other forces. And it doesn't have to always be God. It could be, it exists in many other forms. We also have these perspectives that come from more what we can call secular um, orientation, in which they speak about vulnerability in terms of creativity and openness, and how people, when they're able to let go of this control, they're able to be more creative, and they're able to see new avenues, they're able to experiment, and that is something that actually empowers them. Okay, so now I will move on to my own research that I did in Pakistan with rural and low-income communities. My focus was looking at this relationship between education and empowerment. And the two participants that I would focus on today are these young women who worked as teachers at these schools in their communities, these schools that were designed for girls by an international development agency. These two women were one of the first ones in their rural and low-income communities to have received education, to have paid jobs outside of home. And this was really a big deal in these communities. These women had very distinct status and lived experiences because of being educated. So these women, because I said that they're educated and they had very distinct position in their communities, they were seen as role models for rest of the women. And role models not merely in terms of being educated and being employed outside of home, but in terms of every aspect of their lives. And these women actually took a lot of pride in that their community and women in their communities really looked up to them. But it also put a lot of pressure on them because they were supposed to be this quote unquote together women. And this is a terminology that feminists have coined for women who are considered empowered, that they have to be together in terms of being able to control all aspects of their lives. So for these women, it meant that they were supposed to have very good relationships with their husbands, with their in-laws, with their parents. They were supposed to be very good mothers. They were supposed to be very active participants in their communities. So let me just share some excerpts from my data to provide some insights into what that meant for these participants. Selena said that my in-laws told my mother that I could continue to work as a teacher after getting married if I wanted to, but I would have to take care of home too. And that is what I have done since I got married. My in-laws live with me. So I do our work, that means domestic work, and their work too. They can never complain about me as I take care of everything. In fact, I joke with my husband that he does not need to do anything. I take care of all the problems inside and outside of home. So what that meant was that as these women started working outside of home, their responsibilities at home did not decrease. So they were supposed to do all this work outside of home, but also take care of everything at home that other women were supposed to take care of. Mariam, who was the other participant, she was also married and had 2 kids. She said, it has not been easy for me to take care of my home, my kids, my in-laws, and then go to my job every day. But I do not complain. I get it done. Nobody can tell by looking at me that I live this life. There are days when my backache is so bad, but life does not stop, right? Things have to keep moving. So I keep moving too. So we can see here that these women are feeling the crunch, that they have to take care of everything. But they also take pride in this identity that I do not complain. I do everything. I'm good at everything. And by the way, this is coming from this particular context in Pakistan, but research has shown us that very similar processes are going on in pretty much most of the contexts, including in the US. But it was interesting that whereas they felt that they had to be perfect in all areas of their life, whether it was their professional life, their relationships, their community service, there was one area in their life where they felt that they could be imperfect, and that area was health. Almost all the participants that I worked with, they had some kind of health issues. And these are very young women in their 20s and early 30s. So it was very strange that they had all these health issues, but not surprising given that they had these kind of responsibilities. But interestingly enough, as they tried to keep everything together in other areas of their lives, health was one area where they were not as concerned, as was reflected in this excerpt from Selena. She said, I thought I was going to die. She was talking about her labor pains. They're in a rural area. The hospitals are really far, around 2 hours away. So she went into labor ahead of time. And, it started at night, and she is sharing what happened. My mother-in-law told my husband that it was nothing, but I knew my baby was coming. I felt so helpless. It was like there was no one to take care of me but Allah. I wondered if I was going to die, but knew that Allah would not leave me alone. And then she continued to talk about what happened after she had the baby. She was able to make it to the hospital. I had become so weak and had 2 kids to take care of. I did not know what to do. I could not leave my in-laws' home, but I also did not know how to be there anymore. My husband did not understand what was going on with me. I just prayed and prayed. Those prayers saved me. I'm here today because of those prayers. So in other parts of their lives, they felt that they had to do everything. They had to take care of everything. When it came to health, they felt that they could leave it to this higher power, Allah. And in this case, they felt that as they connected to that higher power in that area, they actually felt more empowered to control other things in other parts of their lives. Similarly, Mariam said that she also had some health issues, and she talked about it by saying, I do not know why I have to bear this, but it is Allah's will. Who am I to interfere? I've gone to so many doctors, but it does not solve the issue. It is only the salt, and she brought it from one of the shrines, that helps. My father tells me that sickness washes away our sins. Sometimes I can't even pick my children. My family is there to help me, but I also know that if Allah has brought these souls into this world, by these souls, it means her children, He will also protect them. It is this faith that carries me through everything. I stop worrying about every little thing. And that's something that happens to them, that they have to be responsible and worried about everything else. But again, she talks about how through this illness, she has learned to surrender and really believe that her children would be fine and she would be fine. So just summing up this part of the presentation. So for these women, health issues were not seen as an outcome of individual choice or lack of discipline or moral worth, as was the case with other areas of their lives, but rather fate that they had to accept. And this is very different from the Western context where health is seen as an outcome of individual choices. So this was very different there. For them, for these participants, health became a site to express vulnerability, lack of control, and surrender to a higher power. And this actually served a very valuable purpose as this vulnerability and surrender created a space for them to extend care, self-care, and care from others to these together women. So they were able to accept care from others in this area of their life, whereas they didn't have much support from others in other areas of their life. This connection to a higher power empowered women to feel stronger and more resilient in the face of adversity in other areas of their lives. The ability to rely on a higher power and others made women feel supported to continue on their path. Okay, so now we will move on to our next presenter, Jingyi.
So after hearing amazing Dr. Khurshid's amazing talk about the women teachers' experiences in the Pakistan, let's change our angle to look at the women faculty experiences, vulnerability, and their empowerment in the Chinese context. So this study focuses on the 4 highly educated faculty mothers with leadership positions who are currently employed in a vocational college in Dalian, Liaoning province, China. So let me briefly introduce the background information about Chinese mothers' identity and responsibilities. So Chinese women's role were defined as mothers, wives, and daughters in the Chinese societies for thousands of years. And their identity usually used to be shaped by the norms regarding obedience to their husband and the production of children in the patriarchal regimes. But after the foundation of People's Republic of China, Chinese women have been achieved social status improvement, economic independence, and educational equity. But the very interesting thing is that even though they have achieved success in education and economic activities, motherhood identities continue to be seen as the central identity for women. So given this context, Chinese mothers face vulnerabilities that they cannot control in many fields. So they are often attempting to balance domestic work, taking care of older parents, nurturing children, earning money, struggling with gender discriminations and their gender difference in employment, as well as experiencing conflicts between work and family. So in my study, these women were working in the higher education environment as faculty mothers, but I think institutions are lacking a view to recognize the burdens and vulnerabilities that these Chinese women are facing. The reason that I see this is because institutions usually assume faculty mothers are productive as good workers, and they suppose faculty mothers are not vulnerable at all. So one of my participants shared a story. She said that once a departmental dean had complained an hour during a mid-level leadership meeting because 4 teachers in his department got pregnant almost at the same time. So he complained that all of them didn't tell him their pregnancy plans. So now he has big troubles arranging the upcoming departmental work. So I have to explain that Chinese higher education environment is relatively relaxed compared with the private enterprises. But even in the higher education settings, institutions still do not allow vulnerable faculty mothers. They need productive workers instead of vulnerable mothers. So we can see that when the motherhood identity and the good worker identity are no longer complementing each other, the Chinese mothers would feel confused and vulnerable. So some of the participants really don't know like how to deal with their vulnerable feelings. One of my participants who was a single mom said that she has to pay duplicate efforts to be a good worker and a good mom. It made her really exhausted. She felt so sorry for her child because she did not fulfill the mother's responsibility and she didn't have enough time being with her daughter. And she also wanted to be productive faculty and leader. And she wanted to have good relationship with her colleagues, but she felt that she ended up messing up everything. So I think faculty mothers experience a process of understanding that why these sacrificial mothers that the nation always propagated present the opposite result in the institutional settings. They don't understand that why the institutions are not satisfied when they actually become mothers. But if we look at the vulnerability in another angle, the strengths of vulnerability, we can go to the next. Yeah, is that being able to accept the idea of, I don't know what to do. So vulnerability makes mothers rethink who they are and what kind of people they want to be. And I think it is in fact, a form of empowerment because they see it in terms of the ability to deal with uncertainty and to stay with uncertainty. So one of my participants shared that she used to feel powerless in terms of balancing work and family responsibilities, but she used years to understand that she is not a superwoman. She told her son that I am your mom, but I am not omnipotent. She has emotions. She can be tired. She has disadvantages as well. So use these years, she learned to seek assistance from her family members, her husband, her parents, friends, and even the community to undertake the burden of childcare. Overall, I think even though the institution is lacking a view to recognize the mother's burdens and vulnerabilities, women can still find their own way to be empowered because empowerment comes from the way that we deal with conflicts and uncertainty. Empowerment comes from the understanding of the unfair nature of higher education institution. It comes from the process of understanding, exploring, accepting, and embracing vulnerabilities. It also comes from the cultivating their own way of mothering experiences. So lastly, I really want to say that mothers understand that being a mother would make them feel vulnerable and uncertain in many fields, but having a child is bringing a joy that comes from that vulnerability. Just because they are mothers, they know that they do not want their children only see that they are mothers. They want their children to see that they can deal with uncertainty and conflicts. They can step out of the image and create a new narrative to see who they want to be. So that's all for my section, and we can move to our next present.
Okay, can you hear me okay? All right. So the themes of vulnerability as a form of strength were also apparent in my study. So my study focused on the lived experiences of 10 queer women / undergraduate students here at FSU during the 2020 to 2021 school year. However, for the purpose of this presentation, I decided to focus on examples given by one participant who I will call Penelope, because her experiences really sort of encapsulate many of the same ideas shared by other participants in my study. So during our interviews, there were quite a few themes that emerged regarding how Penelope and other participants navigated and expressed their vulnerability. But one of the most prominent examples was how participants curated their spaces and interactions so that they could freely express their vulnerability and identities. So in other words, participants actively took part in creating the conditions for their vulnerability to emerge. And one way they did that was by carefully selecting their social circles and who they interacted with. So Penelope, for example, shared that she intentionally surrounded herself with like-minded people and chose spaces where she felt she could be vulnerable. So in the first quote, she emphasizes how her time spent with the FSU's Pride community, and by having a like-minded friend group, it allowed her to feel safe to express herself, although she also recognized that this experience may not be the same for everyone. So this proactiveness in carefully choosing who she interacted with also extended to Penelope's dating life, as seen in the second quote, where she would often ask her partners who were cis men about their thoughts on the LGBTQ+ community before agreeing to a second date. So Penelope, along with other participants, refer to this strategy as kind of like testing the waters when meeting new people, whether it be asking their thoughts about the queer or asking their political views about the queer community, or by referencing queer bands or movies, just to gauge a reaction. And this allowed participants to assess whether or not they could openly express their vulnerability and identities with new people while still remaining safe. So experiences like those shared by Penelope demonstrate how interpersonal interactions can facilitate or hinder feelings of safety that then create space for one to become vulnerable. So sometimes these interpersonal interactions were facilitated by institutional policies and organizations, which in turn influence the school culture at FSU. creating spaces such as the Pride Student Union, where Penelope felt she could express herself without judgment despite having difficulties with social anxiety, as indicated in the first quote. However, Penelope shared that she still often had to negotiate her interactions with others to determine whether a person or space was safe for her to show her vulnerability. She discussed several situations where she felt unsafe and helpless to advocate for herself and others, and often had to minimize or subvert one or more of her identities as a result. So in one example, Penelope shared how FSU, as a free speech campus, allowed protesters to come on campus and advocate for their cause. Though sometimes she said these protesters would harass students, therefore creating an environment that was contradictory to the school's message of safety and consequently restricted students' ability to be vulnerable. So in the second quote, Penelope describes how she felt helpless to support other women peers who were being slut-shamed by a pro-life group while walking to class, for fear that speaking up would compromise her own safety and make her a target. So such examples show that while universities like FSU may help to create safe spaces on campus where students feel they can be vulnerable, such as the Pride Student Union, institutional support is often quite formalized and limited with regards to helping students to navigate their everyday realities. And furthermore, these examples show how participants like Penelope must often negotiate their vulnerability across different social interactions, and that we can't simply look at vulnerability as a binary of weakness and strength. It is situational, it's continuously moving, really depending on changing context and circumstances. All right, so another example of this fluidity is when it comes to vulnerability with regards to how my participants navigated the COVID situation. So more specifically, they demonstrate how vulnerability and safety are often mutually exclusive in the participants' lived experiences. So for example, in this quote by Penelope, she indicates that the pandemic on one hand made her feel very wary about interacting with others in public spaces in case the conversation became too political or conspiratorial. But on the other end, the pandemic created spaces for her to become closer to and more vulnerable with other people in her life through their mutual support of one another. So participants also expressed how they felt comfortable expressing themselves online compared to in person. Penelope stated that she felt that she could openly share her queer identity and safely advocate for herself and other marginalized people online. And as indicated in the first quote, this stemmed partly from having the control and authority to either like friend or unfriend those who were supportive or unsupportive, and also from the lack of physical threat from those who opposed her. And this differed from Penelope's in-person interactions, as suggested in the second quote, where she felt she had to be more selective about who she disclosed her queerness to. So Penelope talks about how in person she sometimes feels she must regulate her vulnerability and minimize certain identities around others. But online, she feels much more free to be herself and publicly show her support for LGBTQ+ causes. And such examples highlight how Penelope and other participants were able to exert a level of autonomy over the spaces they occupied online and create a safe environment where they could be vulnerable and express their queer identities. So furthermore, Penelope described how she would often use her identity as a pansexual woman to start conversations with others, effectively wielding her vulnerability as a source of agency to incentivize social change through interpersonal interactions, as indicated in the first quote. So Penelope's experiences also offer examples of how her memberships in several historically marginalized groups has sometimes made her more vulnerable to others' expectations and microaggressions, therefore synonymizing her vulnerability with fragility. However, Penelope's experiences also highlight how this same vulnerability can be wielded as a tool of empowerment for those who have been marginalized to reclaim their narrative. So Penelope shared her personal journey of accepting and becoming comfortable with herself as a queer woman of color. So while she once correlated these identities with feelings of shame and judgment, she has since grown to embrace them as examples of her strength and resilience. So such examples demonstrate how personal growth and comfort with oneself can shift feelings surrounding vulnerability from that of fragility to that of strength. So Penelope discussed how growing up in a predominantly white area, she tried to subdue her, quote, Indianness in order to fit in with her peers. However, in college, she became more interested in her Indian heritage after taking a world religions course and began to actively listening to her grandmother's stories about India and her family history. So as a result, Penelope found that resilience and strength were central themes in her grandmother's stories and were also present in a lot of Hindu literature. So this prompted her to move from seeing her Indian heritage as a burden to seeing it as an important part of her identity and a consistent source of guidance and strength. So as suggested by the second quote, Penelope's journey towards self-acceptance redefined how she perceived her vulnerability. So once seen as a burden and synonymized with fragility, her vulnerability evolved into a vehicle for her strength and resilience to emerge, allowing her to wield this vulnerability to advocate for herself and others. All right, so just kind of to wrap it all up. So based on Penelope's accounts and other participants, we can surmise several conclusions regarding vulnerability as strength. One is that participants may curate their social interactions in the spaces they occupy to allow themselves to express their vulnerability. Another point is that participants must continuously negotiate their vulnerability as they navigate different contexts and situations and assess whether or not certain people or spaces are safe for them to show their vulnerability. And finally, vulnerability can be reclaimed as a source of agency through self-love and personal growth. So as participants become more comfortable with their identity, then they created pathways for themselves to feel empowered by their vulnerability and use it to advocate for themselves and others. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Melba, who's going to do an amazing job.
Thank you. So looking at the healing and the empowerment and the agency of the women that the three speakers before me spoke about, that all is wrapped up in my healers and their own worldviews. So we're looking at a completely different worldview here. And I'm looking specifically at the focus of my research, first of all, is looking at how 3 Yucatec Maya healers in rural villages in Belize look at how they acquire, how they practice, how they understand the transfer of their traditional healing knowledge, and how that is connected or interconnected with community, with their ancestors, and the environment. And considering that the environment is also considered relatives, non-sentient relatives. So I'll be looking at 2 participants specifically, and I'm using their names because they want to be known not by pseudonyms, but as holders of knowledge that is generations old and is hopefully going to continue for many more generations. So as holders of knowledge, their names need to be spoken out. So there's Anastasia Cetina, who is 67 years old and who learned from her 2 grandfathers. And then there's Aurora Garcia Saki, who learned from her grand uncle or great uncle, who was a very well-known shaman or shaman. And if you look up his name, Eligio Pande, you're going to see a lot of stuff coming up in terms of our Yucatec Maya healer. So in the next slide, then, I want to look at how this uncertainty becomes a means of strength for these women. But I want to lay the background that these women, in terms of Maya people, women coming from Maya, are still bearing or feeling the effects of colonization. And so, Aurora told me we have had to remain silent for many years, but now is the time to speak. We have had to remain silent because we needed to survive. Our knowledge needed to survive. And it comes specifically because if you look at history, Landa destroyed their universities, destroyed their libraries, and killed their healers, their knowledgeable people. So this is where she is coming from when she speaks about this. And then when we're looking at this non-Western view, then the core of their ways of knowing comes from the connection and interconnection between the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical. So in Western science, you're going to look at just the physical. But in non-Western science, you're going to see how the spiritual and emotional are connected. So when they talked about the pandemic specifically then, it was a break for them. And For Anastasia, it was all about uncertainty. Aurora also spoke about that uncertainty. What happens? What happens to us? What happens to our communities? And so in the first quote then, Anastasia is saying, sincerely with this pandemic, I felt very sad. I even cried once because I couldn't tend to them. And she's speaking about the people who came to see her every day. And I get emotional. When they come and I can't attend to them, I feel terrible. However, I'm already old and I need to take care of myself. Me quebró. Me quebró in Spanish means it broke me. But this woman did not stay broken for long. People were calling her. People were coming to the edge of her yard, her property to say, Anastasia, how can you help us? This is wrong with us. And she would just shout it across to them. So she found means to be able to still tend to her patients. So that uncertainty came from, am I well enough to be able to take care of others? And it did not remain long before she knew the answer to that. And Aurora says in the next quote, at the beginning, I said to myself, I know deep in my heart, I know there is a medicine for this in the jungle. I want to share it with the world. But will the world accept it? Or will they say, yes, it is true, it works? So for her, knowledge was already part of her. And knowledge for the pandemic was something that was there. She just had to go seek it. She knew there was something that was happening. She knew that there was medicine for it, but she had to question. So that uncertainty hit her. Like, will the world accept this as some traditional medicine that is not valued? So when we look at vulnerability, then it is embedded in that broader context of the spirits, the ancestors, and the way things have always been done. That is their way of knowing. It's the way things have been done. And so Aurora said, we can't give up and we can't give in. We just have to continue to see what we can do. We just have to hope that things will come back to how they were. It's not only me and you, but it's the whole world. And everything that she mentioned was about that. It was about more, that community that had become global. It's not about us, it's about the world. And so she was then talking about, the other healer was saying, I'm telling you what is happening with COVID. Many people today are seeking traditional medicine. The whole world here, and she meant like Belize, young people, you hear them say, my mom was like this, or my dad was like this, and they used fever grass, the vervain, and they start naming all these traditional medicines. And she continues by saying, the whole world chopped it down because they saw it as just bush, weed. But now, she says, we realize the value of what was there. Now they say it is a cure for COVID. If they, the elders, were alive, our yards, our ranch would be full of all these medicinal plants, lemongrass. We would not be looking for it. We would not be buying it. We would have it readily available. And that is what medicine means to these healers. It is something that is accessible just outside your kitchen door, right in your backyard, in that empty lot. It's full of medicine. So if we look at the next slide, then, when we're looking at vulnerability, these women are talking about this way of knowing and another way of how things are done. So first of all, the way things are done are by means of interconnections. And interconnections for them is weaving past, present, and future. It is weaving physical, spiritual, and emotional. So when Aurora is talking about interconnections, then she's saying, you see, COVID, this virus has shown us that that is how interconnected we are. That is how fast we can connect. Yeah, it's negative, it's a virus, but it's how fast we can connect the world. We cannot only think about ourselves. It's about the whole world being connected by means of a virus. And so her strength then, she's talking about an awareness that even if you don't know, there is still strength because it allows a way of knowing. It's another path to getting to somewhere. And so for her then, and the other two healers, the pandemic is a continuation of doing. It's The pandemic showed us that we learn by taking apart what we know and adding something new. And that is how fluid and dynamic traditional healing medicine and knowledge is all about. And so she is saying, this very COVID that we're talking about, I am listening. I am learning more about it. And I am watching how it is affecting us, how it is affecting the whole world. But the problem is that I wonder if there's anything that I can do. And in almost the same breath about, that uncertainty about knowing what to do, she moved on to say, now the sickness alone gives you another challenge. So it's about action that is different, action that needs to be done immediately. So it's a challenge that needs to be met. So that is what change is. You have to think about what can help you, what different types of herbs you can use. And that is when you're going to meditation. So finding knowledge is not only about what is around you, but what is in you and what is before you and behind you. So that connection is across time, is across space, it's across all these dimensions. Moving on to the next one then, if we are vulnerable, if we are uncertain, the next step is trusting. You have to trust that you do not know, first of all. So when she talks about not giving in, it's again about making sure that that is not the stop, that you move on. So it's a different way of knowing. And she wants the world, she says, I want the world to say it is a healer that is saying it because they know about the plants and they have been doing it for a long time. So she talked about, will people accept the medicine that we are creating right now as time goes on? Will it need to be tested in a lab, or will people just accept it that these people know what they're talking about? And then she went on to say, lots of us know that we no longer use the herbs. We deny them when we know that those are the healing plants from the times of our ancestors. Tell me, if there were any doctors during their lifetimes, no, what did they heal themselves with? So that was what my other participant wanted to know. Those people, our ancestors, didn't have doctors with them. What did they heal themselves with? Plants. And you see a picture of Aurora right there. She went to gather her plants and they broke down the knowledge in that way. This plant is good for extracting mucus from the lungs. The other one is to make your blood a little thinner. The next one is to be able to get rid of inflammation. And that is how they broke down the medicine and brought the medicine back together. So it was a remembering, recalling of the knowledge, and it was a remembering of putting the parts together. Next one, Brittany. So if you're uncertain, if you're trusting, that trust then leads to healing. And for them, they're saying, release all that negativity. So COVID is a part of that negativity. It allows us a space to be able to get rid of that negativity. And so it allows for another space. It allows for a renewal space. And the next one, the next participant was saying, sorry, Brittany, can you go back? Was talking about looking at what do you need to do? You need to believe. You need to trust. You need to have heart, is what they're saying. Because you just can't take an egg for cleansing or medicinal plant and expect it to work. It comes with other things. It comes with belief, it comes with faith, it comes with heart. And the next slide then talks about looking at what are these women saying when they talk about vulnerability. So they're saying vulnerability as uncertainty, first of all, is a positive way of being. It's a way of looking at self. It's a way of life for these healers. This uncertainty is also a space for reaffirming those connections with the spirits of the past, the ancestors, with the spirits of your community, your family, your environment today, using the plants, and they have spirits, and connecting to your children, being safe for your children, so that that can be passed on to the future. So it's a connection, an interconnection. But that uncertainty also is a form of strength, because we are not individuals. We are part of others, and others are part of us. And finally then, vulnerability is working through fear. The uncertain is fearful. and finding courage to act and to be visible, because many of these healers don't want to be visible because it attracts sometimes negative attention. It attracts people's disbelief. And so for them, the pandemic was a way to be visible, but necessary to protect themselves and to protect others and to offer the world their medicine. Thank you. And so I asked Dr. Khurshid then to.
Thank you. So it's not easy to wrap up such wonderful and multi-dimensional stories, but we'll just bring them together by looking at some of the themes that we have used to look at these stories. So what these stories help us understand is that empowerment and vulnerability actually can complement each other. So they're not oppositional as more convention and mainstream scholarship, even feminist scholarship, argues, but they are actually complementing each other in the stories of these participants. These stories also tell us that how vulnerability can invite creativity and newness. And also, we can think of vulnerability based on these stories as something that helps people to develop this interconnectedness and interdependence instead of self-sufficiency and independence, the way it has been defined in more conventional research. So one main idea from here is that vulnerability is not this universal concept that is relevant and useful in the same way for everyone everywhere, because that is one of the limitations of the concept of empowerment and the way it has been integrated into different international development policies, educational policies, in many domestic policies, gender empowerment policies. So it's not a universal context, but concept, but it's a very contextual notion. And we need to look at how context matters. And that's what we try to show by bringing in context in these 4 stories. Thank you so much for listening and for being here. And now we'll open the forum for questions and answers.